On June 3rd, 1965, Gemini 4 is launched into space to begin its 4-day mission around planet Earth. Its goal? To successfully commence and complete the extravehicular activity, also known as an EVA, on the Gemini space capsule. After completing the second revolution, astronaut Ed White was given the go to perform the EVA, while astronaut Jim McDivitt piloted the Gemini capsule. Slowly but surely, the hatch to the Gemini opened and astronaut Ed White began to float outside of the Gemini capsule. By staying close to the Gemini capsule, astronaut Ed White became the first American to have successfully performed the spacewalk. The experience left astronaut Ed White speechless and memorized at the beauty of space itself. When Houston gave the command to head back into the Gemini capsule, astronaut Ed White responded with, "I'm coming back in, and it's the saddest moment of my life." With the help of astronaut Jim McDivitt, the Gemini capsule landed safely back to Earth. After the mission was a success, the American press publicly announced that astronaut Ed White became the first American to walk in space. What many historians don't know today is that Ed White was not only the first American to walk into space, but he was also the first San Antonian to have done so as well. This incredible history should be remembered by the city of San Antonio itself, but for some unknown reason, it has been forgotten. I am your host, Streetlight Historian, and today I will be covering the incredible and tragic story of astronaut Ed White, and I will also be covering the city's role in the Apollo missions.
Okay, first of all, my name is Rudy Purificato. I'm the Senior Historian for the Air Education Training Command at Randolph Air Force Base. And my background, of course, I worked at Brooks Air Force Base, and I have quite a bit of knowledge about the space program with the Air Force. So let me answer that question. So the beginning of the United States Air Force involvement in support of the space program happened back in the 1940s here in San Antonio. Dr. Harry Armstrong, who later became the second Surgeon General of the Air Force, was a scientist and a visionary, and he became the Commandant of the School of Aviation Medicine here in San Antonio at Randolph Air Force Base in the late 1940s. The school had moved from New York. It originally was the School of Aviation Medicine that was established in 1918 at Mineola, Long Island, to validate and test the evaluation of future pilots. And the concept of flight surgeon came from that. So background, the school comes to San Antonio in 1926 and then moved to Randolph in 1931. And in 1949, Dr. Armstrong, Commandant of the School of Aviation Medicine, the scientist himself, who helped develop cabin pressurization for pressure aircraft, decided to create the world's first Department of Space Medicine. Now this is 1949, and his vision was to investigate the final frontier. Of course, President Kennedy described that later on. But Armstrong then started to recruit former German Luftwaffe scientists after the war, and they were brought over here to form his cadre for the new Department of Space Medicine of the School of Aviation Medicine. This is 1949. So during the 1950s, the scientists that he brought over from Germany started to experiment with what's called space capsules. They were actually research chambers that they converted into simulators, space cabin simulator. It's really the space capsule. And they did a lot of atmospheric experiments in these chambers. Now this is through the 1950s. So they started in 52 and through by 1957, the space race had already started with the Soviet Union launching Sputnik 1 using the German scientists that they had recruited after the war. The United States followed suit with the Air Force contributing to that in 1957 with the very famous Ferrel experiment with Airman Ferrel, who made a simulated trip to the moon in a 7-day trip within these research chambers. That was October, so that was 1958. February 1958, the experiment happened right here in San Antonio in Randolph Air Force Base with Airman Donald Ferrell, who volunteered to be sequestered inside a research chamber, which was a space capsule. He was the first person ever to be sequestered inside a research chamber with 100% recyclable air. So that was the United States counter to the Soviet Union launching Sputnik. So this happened in February of '58. That summer, 6 months later, NASA, the National Aeronautic and Space Administration, was created as the world's first civilian space agency. And when NASA was created, they took over what the Air Force was doing, not only here in San Antonio, but also other bases as well. And they actually took over the Project Mercury program that the Air Force had created. So that was the beginning. And because NASA was a civilian space agency, they really did not have the expertise on the hard sciences, the research, so they relied on under contract with the Air Force in San Antonio to support them on the manned space flight program, which started with Project Mercury, with the Mercury astronauts. And the astronauts, the first 7 Mercury astronauts, 6 of the 7 came to San Antonio, were actually medically evaluated, partly medically evaluated for their eyesight and a couple other things at Brooks Air Force Base. The School of Aviation Medicine became the School of Aerospace Medicine in 1960. It moved, it had already moved from Randolph to Brooks Air Force Base in 1959, and the school was very much involved in supporting the NASA and the manned space flight program, beginning, of course, with Project Mercury, evaluating the initial astronauts, and then later on the second cadre or second wave of recruits, astronaut recruits, were actually medically evaluated at Brooks Air Force Base. And then as the Project Gemini was being launched, which is a 2-man space program right after Project Mercury, the Air Force was contributing to helping develop spacesuits for Project Gemini, as well as space food for the astronauts and a number of other things during that time in the mid-60s. And then the Apollo program was the third final program before the actual mission to the moon. And the United States Air Force again was heavily involved in supporting the Apollo program, again with the School of Aviation, Aerospace Medicine that ran now at Brooks Air Force Base, and a lot of that support involved visor designs for the helmets for the Apollo 11 crew, and other things, dosimeters that were being developed for radiation, detection of radiation. A lot of evidence in that area.
if you find more than 5 people who know the important role that San Antonians and the former Kelly Air Force Base, Kelly Field, had with the Apollo missions, you'd be surprised. I'm going to say it started in the very early 60s. I think it was 63, 64, when, oh gosh, one of the first things we did with the Apollo missions as it was ramping up to start getting our folks into space, we helped out with, and I say we, there was a maintenance directorate at Kelly Field, and they developed, I think it was 3 capsules. So those were the capsules that the astronauts sat in, you know, side by side, a little cramped thing at the very top. And they developed 3 of them for testing. So one was used as a flotation test. Now, the idea simply was that the capsule would re-enter the Earth's orbit, re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, parachutes would come out, and it would land in the water. And they wanted to make sure the thing would float. So one was a test bed to make sure it would float. Another one was used, and they made another crew capsule, and they tested egress abilities. So can the astronauts get out of it? And yes, when it's floating. So they did it on dry land, of course, when it's floating. The third one, I've never actually understood all the aspects of, but it was about acoustics testing. So sound traveling within the capsule itself, outside. There's more to it than that. That's just a really rough side. But that was started in 1964. That one of the maintenance directorates at Kelly created those items for NASA. That was one of our first collaborations, really. And it was followed up with the creation of I think it was called a gravity couch. So centrifugal force to see if the pilots could, you know, sustain the elevated G forces. But we made it at Kelly, and then we sent it over to Brooks. So the aerospace medicine testing to make sure we could actually do this, that people would survive. You know, the trip to space, in space, coming back down. A lot was happening at the former Brooks Air Force Base. But at Kelly, they made that couch. So this was almost right after they made the crew capsules. After that, it was all about fuel. It was literally all about fuel. As a matter of fact, the Apollo 11 mission, Neil Armstrong and all that, the liquid nitrogen, liquid oxygen, all came from Kelly, and then it was shipped over to Houston, and they put it in trucks, or it was all taken down there. And one of the neat anecdotes that I heard, the Apollo 11 mission, there and back, used approximately $350,000 worth of fuel. It's a lot of money. Back then it was a lot of money. But if you break it out by mile, it was 73 cents a mile to the moon and back. That ain't bad. In fact, what a good Volkswagen Beetle might have gotten you at the same time. Save for that, it was all about fuel. So for all the Apollo missions, up to the last one, I think it was Apollo 17 with the Skylab. It was the folks that was the fuels, the Aerospace Fuels Directorate at Kelly, creating the liquid nitrogen and oxygen and getting it over to Houston, Cape Canaveral, all the places to launch these missions. They didn't have a big role during the Apollo 13 issue. Of course, that was when the oxygen blew out. It was complications. I know everybody was waiting with bated breath, so to speak, at Kelly, but of course, there may have been some head scratching, like, was it our oxygen that did it? It wasn't any of that. It was another issue, but it was all about fuels. After we created those hard items, the capsules, the gravity seat, and there were a few other things, I'm sure, but for the most part, fueling of the Apollo missions, it was all about Kelly.
Well, Ed White, of course, was from San Antonio. His father was a retired general officer. Ed White made the first extravehicular activity, ECU, in space. The first spacewalk in Gemini, I forgot the name of the Gemini mission, but he made the very first one in 1965. He came back to San Antonio and actually visited Brooks Air Force Base, and I think it was like 69, just before he died in the Apollo 1 fire. I think it was like 66, right around there. And he became, and the San Antonio mayor declared Ed White Proclamation Day honoring his contribution to the space program. And he went back to Brooks, where he received some of his evaluation, medical evaluation, and some of his training. And visited Hangar 9. And but then, unfortunately, he was one of the 3 astronauts who perished in the Apollo 1 fire. And that what happened was, in January 1967, astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White III, and Roger Chaffee were in the Apollo 1 capsule doing a test at Cape Canaveral. So Ed White was selected because he had already gone through the Gemini program, had been successful in the Gemini mission. He was selected along with Gus Grissom and Roger Chaffee to be the first crew of the Apollo 1 program. Now, Apollo 1 wasn't going to go to the moon. It was part of a phase of a series of Apollo missions, but he was selected for that. So they were doing a test at Cape Canaveral, January 1967, and 100% oxygen. At the time, that was the atmosphere that they were using for not only in the Apollo program, but also the Air Force was doing the same thing in some of their experiments as well. So they were doing the test at the Cape Canaveral, and what happened was there was a spark that triggered a fire that killed all 3 of the astronauts. They were the first casualties of the space program. That same week, 2 airmen from the Air Force died in a similar fire in an experiment at Brooks Air Force Base. Eamon Harmon and Richard Harmon and Bartley, Robert Bartley, they died the same week in 1967. And as a consequence, there was an investigation conducted by the Air Force and by NASA on what contributed to their deaths. And at the time, the scientists thought that 100% oxygen was what they need to have for the atmosphere for them to survive in space. But what it turned out, the oxygen saturated some of the material within the capsule. At the time, Velcro was created. It was a new invention, and it became brittle within being saturated with 100% oxygen, almost like kindling. And so here you have a situation where you have materials within the capsule that was become very brittle and susceptible to any type of trigger that would spark the fire, and that's exactly what happened in the Apollo 1 fire, as well as the one that happened at Brooks in 1967. So as a consequence of the deaths of Ed White, Gus Grissom, and Roger Chaffee, and the deaths of Harmon and Bartley, Eamon Harmon and Bartley, the scientists recalculated what they needed to do to preserve the lives of these pioneers in space research. And what they did was they went back to all high school earth science and decided, well, what will be the best mixture of an atmosphere for a space capsule? And they decided, why not use the Earth's atmosphere, the composition of the Earth's atmosphere for the atmosphere within the capsule? And what they did was they actually did that. Now, no longer 100% oxygen, it's 21% oxygen and 78% nitrogen. So Ed White, of course, he died. All 3 of the astronauts died instantly. Ed White was later interred at the West Point Military Cemetery in West Point, New York, next to his father, who was a retired general officer. And that's where he rests today.
Astronaut Ed White is remembered in the 2018 historical movie First Man, where actor Jason Clarke plays the role of astronaut Ed White. Actor Jason Clarke does an outstanding performance of playing the role of astronaut Ed White from the beginning to the final scene of the character. Sadly, this is the only remembrance of astronaut Ed White that the city of San Antonio has recently seen. In 2011, the Ed White Memorial Aerospace Medicine Museum was officially closed to the city of San Antonio, Texas, when the School of Aerospace Medicine left the city in 2011. The reason behind this was that the Air Force had control of the museum and it wanted to be moved to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Once the museum left, so did the history of astronaut Ed White as well. The only remnants of the memorial that is dedicated to astronaut Ed White is a middle school named after him. To this day, It is still unknown why the city of San Antonio won't promote this historical figure that played a major role in space exploration. Hopefully one day, the history of astronaut Ed White will be promoted to the city of San Antonio. But until then, this will probably remain a hidden history in San Antonio, Texas for quite some time.